Hey everybody, what's up? This is David Parsons reporting to you from Ventura, California, my hometown, appropriately enough for today's episode. This is the Nostalgia Trap, if I didn't mention that. Thanks for tuning in. My guest today is someone named Jesse Schwartz. You hopefully know Jesse Schwartz already. If you don't, you should. He's a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College. Jesse I've known since graduate school. I love Jesse Schwartz. He's a wicked smart dude, especially on like 19th century stuff. He does work on Haymarket especially. We don't talk about any of that stuff in this episode. We talk mostly about his background, his youth, and a lot of stuff about the hippie thing and how both of us kind of came to it from different directions. And I guess you could call this like styles of American counterculture, because if you looked at Jesse Schwartz today, you would think this is not a hippie. He doesn't. I think I mentioned that it's something about like him looking like a personal trainer or something. I think I could have said like what I said about Freddie DeBoer, that he looks like an FBI agent. You know, he doesn't play up the counterculture thing. He doesn't feel the need, and he says this on the program, he doesn't feel the need to advertise his kind of personal ideology on the street. Whereas, you know, a person like me who came to it later, you know, I do feel the need to advertise my ideology to people. I think that's part of what this podcast is about in some ways. So, you know, we had a discussion about what it means to call yourself a hippie or identify with hippies or to hate hippies, because, you know, that's part of it too. You know, there's a lot of hippie hatred on the left and the right. And we kind of talked and tried to unpack why that is. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I really want to have Jesse back and do maybe an AM/FM episode with him, because he has so much to say about so many other things. And I really enjoyed talking to him, and I hope you enjoy this conversation too. You can find more Nostalgia Trap conversations at nostalgiatrap.com. They are all totally free, and the interview episodes always will be. But I've got an AM/FM thing going on where we're trying to explore, you know, dystopic topics and things that are a little harder to take. So I've got a dark comic show called Nostalgia Trap AM/FM, and I urge you to check out those episodes, and there's many more on the way. Go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Give me a couple bucks a month, and I've got bonus materials, stickers, buttons that say rude things, including things that will get you yelled out of the subway, on the subway, or wherever you go, if that's the kind of thing you're into. Because I got yelled out of the subway this week for wearing a button that said Bernie would have won. There was someone on the subway train that thought that was a little much to take for him. He put his middle finger in my face and screamed, "Fuck you, homo, Bernie would have won," 7 or 8 times, which was a really fun experience for me. And so if you're looking for that kind of thing, I've got bumpers, stickers, buttons, and things like that. Give me a couple bucks a month and I'll send you stuff every time I produce them, along with new episodes and all sorts of other shit. So please support the podcast, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And thanks so much for listening. This is me talking to the brilliant, talented, and funny Jesse Schwartz. A model of what? Yeah, this is the approach. Oh, you have to hold the microphone up to here. I think that when I talked to Matt Lau recently, I started out talking about like the Graduate Center. Like I did, like because that's where we met.
Yeah,
that's
definitely.
where I know you from the Graduate Center, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so but we were never in any. I don't think we were in any classes together, right?
We took one class together.
What was it?
I'm a little hurt that you don't remember.
Oh wait, it's the Josh Freeman class.
Yes, it was the Josh Freeman class.
Yeah,
it was the
right.
post-World War II culture.
You know what it was? It's don't be hurt, because it's just that you weren't memorable. That's all. That's all it was.
How am I not going to be hurt by that? I actually remember that class really particularly.
Now I am remembering this class. Yeah.
Well, and there was one. I've had this my whole life. Where,
Closer.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Hello.
Like a rapper.
Mic check.
Yep.
Mic check.
Mm-hmm.
I've had this experience my whole life because of all of the things I've been self-conscious about my entire life, which has been, you know, legion. I was never self-conscious for some reason about my height, and because I come from a tiny family,
right.
and everybody's tiny. It was just one of those things that just wasn't. I never wanted to play sports, so it wasn't really an issue. And there was a kid in that class who was about my height. And he had that real, you could like see that he was like,
angry about it.
Yeah, and he would puff his chest out. Right?
Yeah.
He would have that little Napoleon move.
Oh boy!
And every time he made a great point in that, or what he imagined to be a great point
right.
in that class, he would look at me like, see, like short to short, and I was like, dude, I'm not like you.
But it wasn't like he was imagining solidarity between the two of you, because oh my god,
yeah, that happens. That's happened to me a number of times in life where it's you know as if I'm some kind of protected group.
That's
and it's
so,
like men under 5'6".
Well, you know what's funny is I was just in like being like the idea of like the short man. I didn't expect to be talking about this, but the idea of the short man is definitely something that I've thought about a lot in my life because I didn't grow. I'm a tall person. Like I'm like 6'2", but I didn't grow tall until college. Like so in high school I was the short man.
Right.
You know, like literally, and it's especially hard I think to be that in high school because there's like you know there's like every kind of extra cruelty that people have about stuff like that is present in high school.
My best, you make big friends, right? Like my best friend was 6'3".
Yeah.
You know, and I was friends with like a couple of tough guys. You know what I mean? So they would like, you know, they'd protect their little J.
I didn't have that. I had tall brothers, so I just told everyone like I'm gonna be tall one day. Just so, like,
one day I'm gonna come back and kick your ass.
And I really like I just imagined being tall. Like that was the thing. But I don't know. Like I was just in a bar the other day and I saw someone had like just Park Slope Bar or South Slope Bar where like there's graffiti all over the bathroom, and someone wrote like in the men's bathroom, "Fuck, I'm short." Like in the like some guy was like lamenting it while he's drunk. I just imagined like while he's drunk, he like wrote that down.
And you look in the mirror and you're like, oh, like it cuts off my chin. Like I'm so little. I blame Randy Newman.
Yeah. So that class, what was that class? It was like American politics and like
it was post-World War. It was like post-World War II history and culture.
That's right.
Yeah. And it essentially stopped at the end of Reagan. We read the Diggins book on Reagan.
Oh God.
Yeah.
You know he died, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I could have had him on the show actually because he's someone who like went to UCSB and was a total like kind of loady dude at UCSB a little bit. Like every single, I don't know if you went to his funeral, but like there was like a, so John Patrick Diggins was a historian of the 20th century for those that are listening and looking him up. And he was, one of my teachers at the Graduate Center in the last years of his life. And then he died. And when he died, they had a big memorial at the Graduate Center I went to. And every single person that spoke, like Bill Kelly, all these guys, they all just talked about booze. Like every single person talked about how John Patrick Diggins, Jack Diggins, loved to drink.
Yeah.
And like the stories they told were basically that they admired Jack Diggins because he had a schedule. And his schedule was like getting up at 5 a.m. and like swimming and then getting back to his apartment and writing like for a chapter and teaching a class and then being wasted by like 3 or 4 in the afternoon every day. And like he was basically like that was his Tao,
A man needs a code, as Moreland tells us, right?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. So that's what I learned at the Graduate Center.
That was one of my biggest takeaways too. Yeah, I see. It's funny because I remember you in that class because you were very animated. Let's say.
What do you mean?
What? Specifically, when we were discussing Vietnam, you had let's say energetic exchanges with a number of students.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I don't remember that at all.
I remember because I told Justin this. I was like, oh, that guy's really smart and a little strange.
Yeah. No, that's fair. That's,
You'll take that.
Yeah, if that's on my tombstone, that's fine. Yeah, he was pretty smart, a little strange. That's fine.
I really enjoyed taking history classes because you guys in history were always still litigating like theoretical arguments that in English we hadn't talked about for 25 years. Because I remember I took who's the guy? This is bad because he's one of the more famous people there, and he wrote all the famous biographies.
Oh, Nassau?
Nassau, David Nassau. I remember being
he was a guest on the show.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, somewhere.
I remember being in his, and I really enjoyed his class. I took history and theory and practice.
Yeah, he's just like, he's a smart guy, but he's also just personally really fun to listen to.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Well, and also, especially because if you like looked at more of his recent books, you wouldn't have thought of him as particularly like so interested in the theory of history or historiography.
Oh no, he'll go deep though.
Exactly.
On that stuff. Yeah.
And I had forgotten because at the time I was just a dumb grad student. Now I'm
now
assistant professor.
You're a dumb graduate.
But I thought he was a little old fashioned, just like textually in terms of his work. And I took his class and I was like, oh, I'm just dumb. This guy's real smart. He knows it. But what was amazing was that I remember we read Discipline and Punish.
Yeah.
And
Foucault.
Yeah. And there was so much pushback from the students, not him.
Why?
Because they were like, I don't know what this is, but it's not history.
Oh, wow.
And I remember being like, come down on the 4th floor. Like, we're not, and it was like, guys.
Yeah, they hate that shit.
Well, and it was like also, theoretically, you lost that battle like a generation ago. It wasn't even
yeah. And I mean, it's weird because like the postmodern stuff and like the Frankfurt School stuff like would come up like every once in a while in history, and we the students we like wanted. I feel like the history students wanted to hear more about it than the professors. Like our professors were like Nassau is an outlier because Nassau does the theory stuff. I think he's like the only historian at the Graduate Center that likes that theory stuff.
Okay.
Everybody else is just kind of like they're very much defensive about.
But Freeman was very much like he would always talk about Marx and Hegel at least.
That stuff, yes, but not as much like the Derrida and like all that
of course,
kind of
and that's fair. I mean, I guess that stuff's even more troubling for history than it might even be for textual analysis. I get that.
But the thing is, so I was in film, like I was doing film studies classes. That's why I had all that stuff. Like I was unique in the history department because no one else was taking film classes, and I think that's where I got jealous. And the people in history that were into that stuff, like, were jealous of English people, like people from the English
which
department.
is all we had.
Yeah. And because I mean, I think a lot of historians actually look down upon the English as a discipline because they're like, oh, you guys can just study whatever the fuck you want.
We've heard that once or twice.
Right? I mean, which is ridiculous. But I was jealous about that aspect of English. Like, I wanted to be able to
I almost did
do
history.
A more creative project.
Yeah, I almost did history, but I needed the latitude of English. Right? And then the whole idea, but it's not in the archive. I was like, I don't care.
Wait, did you come in with a master's degree to the Graduate Center?
Yeah, but it was in creative writing.
Okay,
so it wasn't like a real.
It wasn't real.
Wait,
where was that from?
City College.
So you went to City College for creative writing?
Yeah.
Oh wait, let's go backwards. Let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm turning on the nostalgia trap time machine, and going back what would be the late 70s, early 80s that you're born?
I'm old. I'm going to turn 40 this year.
Holy God!
So I was born in
77.
October of 77.
Oh, that's a rough year.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, I was born in 78, so we were both born in like just the most forgotten and horrific years in like the late 20th century.
Dark times, yeah.
Carter was president when we were born.
He's
Jesus.
just a peanut farmer.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't remember Carter, but I do remember the guy who followed him.
That was my awakening to political consciousness was having my two lefty, secular, atheist, Jewish parents spitting and cursing at the television every time this like very shiny-haired man came on the screen. That's what
funny.
I remember.
I mean, Ronald Reagan was ghoulish to me when I was a kid. Like I remember that image. You say like shiny, like that. Yeah. The image of him was like this howdy doody, kind of like old man howdy doody doll character. That really kind of freaked me out, but I think I knew that people respected him. I certainly didn't have family members spitting at the television.
See, that was what was interesting to me is I only knew what I didn't know that people respected him.
Yeah.
I didn't understand why this man who had like a relatively soothing voice and was always speaking in very calm tones, why it like exercised my parents so extremely. Like, it was like literally he would come on and say something, my mom would just be like,
Did they explain that to you? I mean, at what point do you get your parents' politics?
Oh, I'm sure they explained it to me.
Yeah.
I did not get it.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think I got it until I don't know. It's a good question actually. Now looking back, because I grew up Jewish in a very non-Jewish area, and I also grew up with like hippie parents in an area that didn't. It's for the listeners out there.
Yes, please. Where exactly are you talking about?
So
you're from New York, but I don't know where
I grew up in suburban New York. People, refer to it like the whole region as the Hudson Valley.
Okay.
And the kind of micro region.
Not Westchester.
No. It was very important to my parents to not move to Westchester or Long Island because they were hippies. Like they wanted land. Well, actually, it's not true.
Okay.
My mom wanted to stay in the city. But I come from 100 years of Bronx Jews. Very long line. My parents were the first to leave. My mom has since returned.
So there's an intersection of Judaism and hippieism in your family.
Yeah, I mean, not an uncommon one, especially for New York.
Right. Yeah. And your parents, is that what brought them together?
No,
their shared hippiness.
No. My what brought them together was my dad was friends with her older brother.
Okay.
And as he liked to kind of aggrandizingly put it, he had dated everybody else, and so then that was when he met.
My dad tells the exact same story about my mom.
I imagine it's pretty common and not particularly true.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just it's always like just like this loud, condescending story that puts him as the star.
Yeah, exactly.
And her is just like
up and down Allerton Avenue, man. I was with everybody, so finally met your mother.
This is who I settled with. I love of my life. And it's just like
well, they got divorced, so they were clearly not.
well, I mean, those were they like okay? So your parents were like '60s people.
Yes,
and by
very
that
much
I
so.
mean like kind of engage in what the politics and social
Yeah, and they
cultural
were.
thing that
So I was a
on.
vegetarian until I was 5.
Wow.
But because I was raised in what is still a pretty conservative area, less so now. I mean, like people, it's so funny to me, where everybody now talks about like going to Beacon.
Yeah.
For the weekend.
Yeah.
And like Beacon growing up was just like, it's where you went to get weed on the
Yeah,
street. It was like a little, and all of those cities.
I
up
get
there.
that. Yeah.
So I grew up right in between Poughkeepsie and Newburgh.
Okay.
And all over the little towns.
Okay,
So
yeah.
Southern Dutchess County.
That is a region that like people are, and when I say people, I mean like hipsters in New York are starting to move there.
Now,
like those, all those places.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
you go buy a house up there.
It was an awful place to grow up.
Yeah.
It was
I get the feeling that Newburgh still kind of is.
Newburgh and Poughkeepsie are the cities of our.
I mean, no offense to anyone who's out there.
No. I mean, they're. I mean,
You live in hell. God bless you. Yeah.
I mean, they were, they used to be manufacturing towns,
Yeah,
right?
right.
They are classic disinvestment cities.
Well,
right?
yeah, taking the train ride, like just up to like Saratoga, going up there and like through all these just busted out towns.
Yeah.
It's horrifying.
Well, because it used to.
I mean, I know you see like just from the train, you always see like all the like kind of rusted out post-industrial shit,
Right.
But stopping in those places, you get like I just remember like stopping in those places and like having a cigarette at the station and stuff, like looking around at what's there. And just being like, yeah, these are places that time forgot.
Well, and
yet there's still people there,
right? And you see, especially Poughkeepsie, which is the one I spent the most time in. Like Poughkeepsie is this absolutely gorgeous. It used to be called. Well, it's still called the Arterial. It's a circle that goes around it. And the houses there are these beautiful, like Victorian houses that have just fallen. And so you can see that there was this. It was, first of all, it was like a bedroom community. Right, for like summer exodus.
Right.
But then it was also a kind of a Hudson River like industrial town where boats going up and down from the city would do any number of different kinds of businesses or picking up or dropping off, and it hasn't existed for 50, 60 years. And so they're just it's ironic. Looking back, it's a strange choice as to see my father, who was wanting to leave the Bronx,
right,
to go to get some land to go into Southern Dutchess County. There are some prettier areas closer to that that he could have chosen. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what's the land thing about? I mean, because I think I know, I have a general idea, but did they actually do anything with that land?
No. It was a suburban bullshit. No, there was. I mean, that's the thing is, and
you're like, oh God, no, fuck no, we didn't do any of that.
No. And I mean,
we just had a backyard.
My father and I are very close, right? He's one of my best friends. But I mean, and I think he'd be the first to admit that most of these things were kind of fetish objects. There wasn't anything substantive there. It was just to get out of the city, and my mom really didn't want to leave, but my dad, it was very important, and he got a job upstate, and so they both were they both started as high school teachers.
That's what I was going to ask, is like, what is their relationship to education and stuff? Because you ended up becoming like, this hyper educated dude, and you're a teacher. So like,
I went to the grad center.
Yeah, that's not hyper educated. We can find another term for that. But
kidding, I love the GC.
No,
I love the GC.
Seriously, I mean, it was a really formative place for me.
Yeah, me too.
And it still is. Like, I still think about that place. And
me too.
I still have folders like on my hard drive of like they just say like orals or whatever I like go into and just like flick through those PDFs every once in a while.
I was just looking. Shout out to Steve Kruger out there. In Radioland. I took my first class with him.
Wasn't he the chair of the department while
he was the
there?
chair for 6 years that I was there, and it was wonderful. And I took my first class at the grad center with him on Chaucer, and I was just going through old folders and just looking at this paper I had written, right, that I was wildly uninformed about. I mean, even more so than the other things I read about, right, and making this, big argument and thinking like, oh, right, that was like, I was so energetic my first year.
Oh, yeah, no, totally. And I look back on it, it's like, that's a long time ago, and I was a different person, 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, it did like totally bring me to a different place, wherever that place is now. I wasn't there before.
Right.
I mean, in terms of like we talk about like fetish, like at what point did that like interest in, I don't know, learning happen for you? Because like you're talking about like opening up a PDF of like some, arcane, piece of a primary source from the 19th century. I mean, at what point do you think that like you're a person that wants to study for your life?
Oh, I think I mean, I don't know. It's interesting.
Did you like school when you were young, like really young?
Okay, so
because I hated school.
I didn't I didn't hate school,
Yeah.
but I didn't like school. I didn't care either way.
Right.
But I didn't do anything that I didn't want to do. And so I would say, so my parents put me, because again, that was like the thing. My parents put me in a Montessori school for kindergarten.
Yeah. Which are hot now.
They are hot again. I mean, it's like with I think my teenage years coincided with the second hippie revolution. Now we're having the third, apparently, with the Coachella and all this bullshit, right?
Yeah,
it's like the mid '90s, and now. So I was in.
And how much of that? I don't want to interrupt you, but how much of that discourse about hippies has to do with like how you raise your kids? Like homeschooling, vaccinations, gluten. Like I'm thinking about like that kind of stuff.
Oh, okay. So my parents weren't insane, so they had me vaccinated.
Right.
Thank God.
I feel like that's the phase now. Is like the conspiracy parent.
Well, I mean, because each revolution of this has to be even more ridiculous than the last one, right? So it's like, what's like a problem that we've solved and we can like reopen again, right? Vaccinations,
Yeah. No, raising your child in the age of chemtrails.
Exactly. Now that's a new Dr. Spock I would read.
Dude, I have people in my family who are very concerned about the shit in the sky and what it's doing to their kids.
And I would say my parents politically, my dad had very strong opinions, but he was very cynical.
Okay.
And so I remember very clearly being a kid, and talking to him about this, and the line that he would have, which is, not politically correct at all and rather sexist, but he would always say that I vote for whatever horse sings my song.
Yeah,
and then he'd laugh and say, actually, I haven't voted since McGovern.
Wow.
Right. And so that was he was very much and I think that actually part of him, as I've gotten older, right, and you can actually think about him as a human and not just your father.
Yes.
I think that part of the moving upstate was just to kind of check out, just like because my mom taught high school English for 31 years in northern Westchester. My father's a psychologist, but didn't want to, as he once told me, didn't want to sit in a fucking room and listen to people's problems all day. So he became a college professor. And that's where actually I didn't.
You still got to do that when you're a college professor, though, just not as much.
Not quite the same.
It's not as much.
Not quite the same. And so
they listen to your problems, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
So growing up, my mom was the one who would my mom and my dad were both pretty well read, but they would have like a lot of weird hippie books. Like they would have like these like real deep hippie books, like What to Do Till the Messiah Comes, like these books that no one even talks about anymore.
Oh yeah.
They'd have like Be Here Now and shit and like Ram Dass.
I have a section actually. I'm close to it now. I'm looking at as you're talking. I have a section of my bookshelf that's filled with all sorts of that. Like In Search of the Miraculous.
Yes, yeah. And there was a whole and some of them I would read them, without really understanding the context. And I remember there was this really bizarre books by this guy Hugh Prather, who no one has. I've never heard anyone like reference him, since. And it was really funny because in many ways, the titles of the books chronologically like mirrored the way that I imagined my dad becoming more and more cynical, because the first book was called like I Touch the Earth Touches Me. And then the last one was called Pardon Me, You Just Swallowed My Soul.
Beautiful.
And I was like, oh, this is like
a progression.
This is when like darkness envelops the whole moment.
That whole connection, it sounds like that whole connection between like cynicism and the politics is really interesting to me. Because like, I mean, when you describe your dad as cynical, like what exactly do you mean? Is he like kind of like the person that just looks at the system and just sees it all as like hopeless?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and in many ways, as I think, as a way to cover his own lack of activity or investment, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think he knows, right, that the only way that you can improve anything even marginally is by, God forbid, getting involved. And I think so he would like to.
That's a waste of time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so now, he's got like, I mean, I think this happens to all of us, right? I was just talking to a friend the other day as I approached 40.
So fucking familiar to me, honestly.
Yeah. Well, I think it's familiar.
Yeah.
And I was just talking to a friend that like if the 15-year-old me met the 40-year-old me, right, he would like a sellout would be the nicest thing he'd call me.
Yeah.
And I would just look with such compassion on this tiny little being, this stupid kid. And so I think that
and just fucking throw money in his face and be like, you'll learn one day.
Well, and then I would tell him all the horrible mistakes he would make. But yeah, so I think my dad, now he's got like a fucking BMW. He's enjoying the baby boomer fruits that no other generation in the history of the world will ever be able to experience.
So beautiful.
Yeah. My mom, I think, is much. Even though she's much less like my father has a big afro.
Yeah.
And he wears.
Still?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And he wears like tie-dye and
shit.
like and like all of my old hippie shirts he still wears, which is a real kick to,
wow,
to
so
see.
he visually is a hippie.
Oh yeah. Like
Yeah.
he wears like a yin yang like necklace and shit. Yeah. And as a kid, my
I feel like your dad and I would get along, man.
Oh yeah, no, he's a great guy. He's
Yeah.
funny as hell, and he's got like really great. He's just like a neighborhood guy, like a
Right.
Jewish guy from the Bronx.
Right.
He's funny as hell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was a big influence on it sounds like your
The
politics.
biggest,
And,
and I'm just culturally. I mean, he was the one who
Right.
helped me become, a dumb hippie when I was a teenager.
yeah, I mean, when you say like dumb hippie as a teenager, was that like a culture that was around you among young people too? Like where
So-
you're at? Because I feel like when I think about like that area, and I think about upstate New York, I do feel like there's that going on.
Well,
like,
Woodstock
there's
is
like kind of a Grateful
obviously
Dead shit going
Yeah,
on.
well, Woodstock is there, and there's all these little pockets. Millbrook, where
Dylan
Timothy
lives up there somewhere.
and they just sold the Pink House where
That's
he
right.
and the band, like
Did the basement tapes?
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, it was like 6 years ago, but at this age, that just seems
Yeah,
just
yeah, definitely.
And Millbrook, the Millbrook Mansion, where
Yep.
Timothy Leary used to do
Yep.
all the acid stuff, right? My dad has all these great stories of going up there.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
crazy.
Hey, that was the joke he always said. He said, yeah, you and a couple friends, would go up, and you whoever you were dating at the time would end up staying there with Timothy Leary.
No shit.
Yeah, he was apparently very charming.
Ah,
Yeah, which
yeah,
you
no,
can see.
I mean, yeah, I kind of suspected that.
Yeah.
It's funny that it's funny to me that there's and I wish someone would write about this. Maybe someone listening and pick this up for their dissertation. But like the whole like, it might be an English dissertation, not a history dissertation. But like the whole idea of like an East Coast, West Coast psychedelic thing happening in the '60s is so fascinating to me. That like the whole like Ken Kesey.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a famous story of like Ken Kesey and like all the merry pranksters taking their like psychedelic Dayglow bus across the country, going to Millbrook to like go meet
Right.
with Leary and like have this like meeting of the West Coast psychedelic people and the East Coast psychedelic people.
Right.
And Kesey, like very famously, Ken Kesey and his people didn't even go inside. Like Leary didn't even want to talk to
Right.
them. Like they're like two completely different worlds they came from. Like Leary was a academic that wanted to like take acid and like take notes and record things and like be very, very scientific.
Kids
about
at
it.
Harvard were eating
Yeah.
barks off of trees.
Yeah, collected data
Yeah.
about it. And Casey was more like a kind of like chaotic trip guy who wanted to just like party and like have a kind of.
I also think it's also just masculinist, right? It was just like territorial, and this is mine.
That's what I'm thinking
yeah,
too. Is
yeah.
that it has a lot to do with the girls too.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's 68. It's like, this is mine. It's, yeah. And
Oh God, it's so fucking weird. So your parents, or so your dad is like firmly rooted in that culture, at least
Yes.
in that scene.
Yeah.
So like that scene of like hippiness doesn't belong in academia in a lot of ways.
Right.
Right.
I mean,
like,
and it's funny.
that stuff is laughed at in academia.
Right. And it's funny because when I see people, and I'll admit this on a radio show, like when I see people even who work on the beats,
Yeah.
right? I'm just kind of like, come on, come on.
Hey, I worked on the beat.
I mean, if it's,
Yeah,
this
exactly.
interview is not
No,
going well
yeah.
anymore. And for me, it's like, if it's not Burroughs, I'm not interested.
Right.
And,
Totally.
But you're
But
absolutely.
you see why the beats are a gateway drug.
Right.
Right? Like
Right.
I see why people do that shit.
Right.
Like I wrote about the beats my first paper at the Graduate
course.
Center. I was
And-
like, I'm gonna write about Kerouac and all that shit.
Well, and the only reason I get embarrassed for it's just projection. It's
Yeah.
because I'm humiliated by who I was when I was 15.
and I'm sitting before you, and like you're talking about like, oh yeah, the hippie family, this and that, this and that. But like I have long hair. I look more like a hippie than you do. Like
time.
you do not look like a hippie.
Part of it was, I mean, I have pictures. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
used to have like
Did
dreads
you
and
do it?
patchwork
Are you
pants.
serious?
Oh yeah, when I was 17.
Holy shit.
When I graduated, I went to community college for my senior year of high school.
Yeah.
And just took off. And so I was 17 and we moved to California, and I spent the next few years just like hitchhiking around and went to like 30 Dead shows.
Yeah.
I was never, and I want this on the record, I was never a Fish fan. I'm very proud of that fact. All right.
Well,
And
you're getting into like the deep politics of that.
Yeah, I won't
Of-
descend
yeah,
so low.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Who's Fish? Who's Grateful Dead? And I feel like there aren't a lot of people that are into both.
Well,
Right?
I mean, now there's really no. It's not a. They just
Yeah.
win by
Yeah.
being around,
Right.
And when the Dead picked, I mean, I haven't listened to the Dead for many years, but when they just recently picked John Mayer to fill in for Jerry Garcia, I was like, I'm sorry, get behind thee, Bob Weir. You are dead to me, my friend. Yeah. But so I used to.
Yeah. At what point do you not wear that stuff anymore?
Well, I mean, talk about cynicism. It's so God. This is I mean, I guess this is the point of the show. But to look back,
Yeah.
I was really determined to kind of avoid the cynicism of my father. And it was very important to me, right? I imagined California, right, as so many nebbishy lefty Jewish guys from New York had done before him, right? I imagined California, right, and as just this like hippie paradise. Like you get there and people just, you know, like give you like a headdress made out of twigs and a joint, right? Like that was what I'm like, welcome to, like at the border, welcome to California.
Yeah, I feel like people in their minds have this like image of like a girl in a bikini like roller skating on the boardwalk and everyone like in Venice Beach kind of, and just, like hanging around, like you can just buy a joint anywhere. And,
I
like,
had more of
that Hollywood version.
Yeah, I had more of a Northern California fantasy
Okay.
where it was young people wearing like very flowing clothing.
Yeah,
that was
what North Beach, San Francisco.
Yes, yeah. Like hate kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And so I remember very clearly it was a decision. This was a decision. I was 12 years old and I was in the car and I didn't really have musical taste. I was into metal.
Yeah.
Because that's what, you know, lots of
It was
young...
popular around that time.
Yeah, exactly. And that was, you know, the first tape I ever asked my parents to buy was Quiet Riot, Metal Health, right, which I still think is a great album.
Yeah.
But I was listening to that and Madonna, right? So
Sure.
I didn't really have like I hadn't really identified myself by music yet. And I remember I was in the car and my dad and I were driving back from somewhere and the Grateful Dead's Ripple came on and I really liked it and I was like, what was that? And he was like, oh, that's the Grateful Dead. And I was like, I like that. And my dad got so excited. And he was
Let
like,
me get this shoebox full of tapes out.
That was exactly. He was like, if you liked it, I have all their albums, and like he made me tapes, and I was like, oh, okay, that's it. I'll be a hippie, right? And it was just kind of, and then like I think like the next weekend or something, we went up to Woodstock, and I bought a bunch of, you know, hippie T-shirts, and that was it. That was my identity.
Yeah.
And so I moved to.
This is so perfect because it so fits in with the like, I don't know, people from hippie parents often are not hippies later. Like,
well,
like, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't pass down. It like skips a generation.
Well, and that's what's funny was because I remember asking, I got angry because I would try to rebel.
Yeah.
And I remember right before my parents got divorced, I was like 11 or 12. And I remember saying, you know, like my friend got his ear pierced. And I remember coming home being like, you know, Mom, Dad, I want my ear pierced. You know, and I was like, posturing like I was doing something terrible.
Yeah.
And and my dad's like, okay. And Mom's like, oh, I think it'd look nice. I'll take you. And I was like, then forget it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I don't want to
Like,
do it then.
Yeah, screw you. You don't understand.
Yeah. No, what is that repressive tolerance?
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yep.
And so I remember even asking him, I asked my dad, I was like, what can I do to like piss you off? You know? And he was like, you could join the Young Republicans Club.
Yeah.
And he was like, or you could join like the Future Business Leaders of America. And I was
Yeah.
like, and I even toyed with it because I was so young, I didn't even know what these things meant. And I was like, maybe I will become a conservative. And then I was like, started looking, and I was like, oh God, no. Right? Like,
Yeah.
no. And so what in many ways, the only thing I could do was like be even more extreme, right, in that whole, you know, performative aspect of hippiness than my dad.
Yeah.
And I had, you know, those little stupid white boy dreads and
Oh my God.
yeah, I mean, this is like a, you know, for
What do you think about that now when you think about that person? Because I mean, I've always known Jesse Schwartz as a guy in like a black T-shirt that looks like, you know, he could be a personal trainer or something like that.
Wow,
You got short
I'm
hair.
flattered.
Yeah, you got short hair, clean cut, straight ahead kind of dude.
Yeah, that was
looking at you. You'd never guess that you once had dreadlocks.
Well, and that was by design, right?
Yeah,
And that was something that was really became important to me. Was, I mean, you just grow the fuck up, right?
Sure.
And you no longer need to just project your identity to strangers on streets.
Yeah,
you know, like
right.
I don't care
Yeah.
anymore. You know, it was also going out to California and like I did the whole thing. You know, like
Yeah.
I was like living on the boardwalk in Santa Cruz and like sleeping on the like that whole obnoxious mid and early '90s. It was '95 when I went out there. But
Wait, you went to college in Santa Cruz?
No. I just was
Went out
pieced
there.
out. Yeah, just
Yeah.
me and my friend. We just drove out there and then that was it.
Wait, I have to pause on this because this seems like an important moment. Like, why'd you go to Santa Cruz?
Because again, California still
It was like that was the like Oz to you.
Well, and it's such an East Coast like fantasy stereotype that, you know, like growing up, especially, you know, everybody in my family were if not hippies, they were at least liberals, if not more. And so it was always just, you know, when you're steeped in that, you know, kind of, you know, you just like that music and all that, you know, you listen to like Eric Burden, right?
Yeah.
And his voice to me
Yeah.
signified Northern California, you know, like, and I just wanted to see it, you know,
Yeah.
I wanted
Yeah,
to have this
totally.
experience. And I had
It's
gone.
funny that it was northern for you.
Well, San Francisco.
Yeah, totally.
It was always San Francisco.
Uh-huh.
And the house in the middle of the woods in Watsonville outside of Santa Cruz had this, and my hippie cousin, who was like an actual like hippie, who lived in like this A-frame house in the middle of the woods in Watsonville outside of Santa Cruz.
Yeah.
And my dad said that the last time he saw cousin Lloydie, and he said the last time he saw Lloydie, he was like selling weed out of his like studio apartment on St. Mark's Place and had two giant grape.
Hello, Nostalgia Trap listeners. This is Peter Sabatino joining you for the first time. I'm the producer here at Nostalgia Trap. I just want to let you know that David fucked up the recording. He's not a technical person. It's totally fine. He started it again and they picked up and continued where they left off. Sort of, not really. It's going to be a different conversation, but it's not that big a deal, okay? So shut the fuck up. Don't fucking judge. Get on with your fucking lives. All right, here we go.
So in Santa Cruz, what was going on in Santa Cruz when you were there? Because Santa Cruz is a place that came up a couple times on this show. It was always a place that I don't think I've ever actually been to Santa Cruz, but it was always a place that occupied a certain place in the cultural imagination in California, a place where you knew that a lot of fucking hippies and drugs hang out.
Yeah, and it was like a little city in this way that it had. It wasn't as manicured as a lot of other little cities, up and down the California coast. Like it had like a downtown and a quote unquote bad part of town, which was not bad. It just was not white.
Right.
And it had, a beach, right? And so it seemed like it was like a self-contained unit that like actually was an urban space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there were just tons of, hitchhiking / homeless / just traveling kids just on the boardwalk.
That whole, I've called it the hippie highway before, but like that whole like I don't know the whole like passageway between, I would say, Santa Cruz and like central coast of California all the way up to like Oregon and Portland and Seattle. Yeah. Like there's it's I think of it. I think there was like an HBO special about like heroin up there, but like it's heroin and a lot of other drugs, but like the particular culture to it, it's white people and like kind of hippied out white people.
Yes, and that was
it everywhere up there.
Yeah, and the West Coast has always really struck me about well, first of all, how white it is, but
it's upstate New York kind of.
I think even upstate New York's more diverse.
Really?
Yeah. But it was definitely like kind bud.
Yeah, sure.
Like they didn't even have, when I was in high school, like all you got was just, crappy
Well,
swag.
you're from the East Coast.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
and so it was just like this whole different...
We used to just hear about horrible things like that.
Yeah, oh yeah. No,
if I move from here, I'm not going to be able to get this kind of weed
It was
anymore.
true. It wasn't like a, national industry the way kids, count your blessings, kids. So yeah, we were out there and
How long did you stay there?
I was there for a year.
Okay.
But most of the time we were like, hitchhiking back and forth to different, like, to San Francisco or to Boulder.
Shouldn't you have been in college at this time?
Yeah, but I didn't. that's how stupid I was.
You didn't You didn't want to go to college out of high school?
To me it was like Babylon, man. And it was like, I don't need this. I know. I'm part of my like self-flagellation about this is why I want to talk about this on a radio show, because I feel it's so embarrassing that I feel the only way I can actually make peace with it is by making it public.
Well, it's the hippie ethos in a way is kind of like a total disengagement with the society.
Yes.
Like, and seeing like anything in the society or anybody participating in it as somehow sold out or somehow like sullied and dirtied by participation in whatever economy.
Well, and then of course the minute you actually spend time within at least the like street kid version of that, you realize how intellectually, and ethically incoherent that position is.
Yes.
Right? Because they are very much living in an essential part of Babylon. They're just begging for change, right? Because they won't sully themselves with work, but they have no problem. We could get really
No. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. And so that was the first thing that really started to happen, was where I don't know what I expected.
Yeah.
But I didn't expect something as intellectually bankrupt,
Well, it's because do you think it's part of the intellectual bankruptcy is like just the fact that like so many of those kids are just, it's a cliche, but they're not rebelling against the system. It's like aimed at their parents and like a certain kind of like, in other words, it's like middle class white kids that get into this a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Who are just like, they have a certain attitude towards work,
right?
That just wasn't there.
Well, and that's what really started. One of the things that my parents did, which I really appreciated, was when and my parents, it was really interesting because we were always middle class, but my parents were teachers, and so they made less.
Yeah, right.
But that because they were teachers, they were intellectuals, right? And so we had, more books, right? And so, I never felt any kind of deficit, compared to my other friends, even though they had bigger houses or nicer cars, was because, my parents knew things, right? And that to me, it was in this kind of like transactional understanding of how this works. And that was one of the things that I started working very young, because I remember when I was 11 or 12, I think I was 11, or maybe I just turned 12, I told my father, and this is a very formative experience for me. I remember I told my dad I wanted a stereo. And he was like, well, get a fucking job, and I was like, I'm 12, I can't work legally. And so he called this guy. My dad used to teach special ed for, I believe the phrase then was behaviorally disturbed children. That was the phrase they used to use when he was teaching there. And so one of his former students who just had impulse control issues,
right,
and learning disabilities, right. So of course they just shunt him off and say, he's a hopeless case. That was the 70s, right. And I guess depending on where you are still today.
Yeah.
But so he opened a fish market, and my dad got me a job at this fish market, Captain Cliff's fish market. It's not there anymore, and actually Captain Cliff was tragically killed years later. But so my dad, and I'm
totally looking up Captain Cliff later.
Yeah. And so I'm like, I'm 5'5" now. At that age, I was, 4'6", 70 pounds. I was like a tiny little dude.
You're
right?
5'5"?
Yeah.
You are not.
I just have a big personality.
Yeah. I never think of you as that.
Yeah. And so that's why I have those issues with guys in our class.
They're thinking it matters more than it does.
Yeah. Exactly.
Just be a fucking person, for Christ's sake.
Yeah.
We all hate ourselves, dude.
Right.
It doesn't matter.
Exactly. There's so many different reasons.
Every single person in this room is thinking about how their body and face is disgusting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm deficient in so many more fundamental ways than my height.
It's like, if you think my body's a problem, you should see what's inside.
I know. It's all right. We're getting a little too real now.
Yeah, that is real.
So I got this job, and Captain Cliff was this wild dude, right?
Yeah.
Had never done well in school. I think came from a pretty again, one of those rough, shitty little cities. And so it was me. It was this guy Donnie, who was his wife's. Captain Cliff's wife's brother, and Donnie had just got out of prison for selling coke.
Beautiful.
And then there was a little person named Mikey who also worked there.
Right.
And so they would and they were just, everybody was insane. Right. It was this time that would only exist in the late 80s. Right. And so the thing, and so Donnie was selling coke out of the back. I didn't even know what the hell he was doing. I just knew a lot of sketchy dudes were rolling into a fish market.
Sure.
And they would
what else is a fish market for?
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And they would always make jokes about me and the little person wrestling, but it was an adult male. You know what I mean?
Shit.
Yeah, it was a very strange time.
Right.
And but my dad said and I think my dad did it on purpose, was you want to learn what money is? This is what money is. Yeah.
It's miserable.
Yeah, and Captain Cliff he would I just clean the bathroom over and over and over.
Jesus.
But man, did he cook. He would just use all the fish that was one day old, and we would have these feasts. But so anyway, part of the reason I'm saying this is because when I went out, to California, that was exactly what I felt, right? From so many of these kids was just I was you're not outside. There's no outside.
Yeah,
and
right.
that was the first time.
You're fooling yourself that you're outside of this system.
Right.
You're actually just choosing to be in the shittiest position
Right, and
you could
you're
be
the
in.
worst. You're like the exploiter of the exploiters. You know what I mean? You're the worst part. And in many ways, I look back at that realization of the hippie community in California to see, even before I was reading the stuff, me kind of coming to a more Marxist conception.
Yeah,
right?
that's what I was gonna.
Yes, and that well, yeah,
that's that seems like that's the next step,
right.
or not even the next step, but another plane of reality and thinking about these issues is getting away from just the kind of vague hippie cynicism about the system to a more kind of concerted effort to understand that system.
Well, and a system that actually has explanatory power, right? I mean,
Yep.
as a system that's not making these claims where I'm looking at these dudes spanging, on the corner and just I don't, it was.
Also, we have that the equivalent of these dudes, and they are a lot of dudes.
Mm-hmm.
like anarchist dudes in New York, like in Tompkins Square Park.
Right.
And those guys are like, as much as I'm sympathetic to the whole like anarchist perspective and everything, those guys are fucking assholes. And like when I go by, like hey, give me $1, fuck you,
right?
You know,
right?
The guys that like tattoos all over their faces and shit.
Yeah.
And like talk about like performing,
right?
Like you're kind of like you're performing.
I hate your system, but pay me from it.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
Right. And like that. I'm so much more likely to give money to someone that like acts it's such a weird way of like deserving poor, whatever the fuck.
Right.
Okay. But like either way, I don't give money to anyone. I'll put it that way. But like walking through the village and seeing those guys with like their 50 dogs, there's always the same kind of like visual culture to who they are.
Right.
And it's a club that has. I have mixed feelings about. Put it that way.
Well, and it's interesting because at least in the mid '90s in California, I actually ended up, we called them gutter punks then. I'm told that now that term is offensive and now they prefer crusty punks or
crust punks.
Yeah, I would love to, I just keep meaning to Google why
there
it's
were
offensive.
crust punks at the Graduate Center while we were there, like kind of like, left for.
Oh, yeah, with like those weird like train conductor hats and shit. Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
There were a couple students and I was like, I think that person might be like a quarter crust punk. Like their grandfather was a crust punk and they're still got the fucking train hat on.
Right. They count.
Yeah.
Well, and so what was interesting though to me when I was in California was I actually found I hung out with a lot more gutter punks than I did hippies after a time, because in my experience in the 90s at least, they were much less anarchist and much more just very honest about like, fuck it. Like I'm just like out here to get high and drunk and do whatever the hell I want.
Which is more honest, yeah.
Right, and they didn't pretend in the way that the hippies were pretending and still being the same monsters that they were trying to escape.
I'm just high all day because I don't like the system.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, just be honest. You just like to get high all day.
I smoke
It's
weed
fine.
To destroy capitalism.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, it's really taking a hit.
It's
right?
amazing how many people convince themselves that that's true. Like I mean that was Leary's thing, right?
Right.
Was like literally tune in, turn on, drop out. Like do acid and don't engage with the society at all. Which sounds so fucking absurd now.
Well, but
weird.
it makes perfect sense
in the context, yeah.
Well, and especially if you think about it from Leary, right? It makes perfect sense that approach to the science of changing society would have been codified by a former Harvard professor.
Sure.
Right? Like you cannot talk about more like bigger keys to the castle. Right? And that he's the one who says, drop out on my, 40 acres in Millbrook.
Yep.
Please bring the youngest, most attractive women you can find.
Yeah.
Right? Like that and that to me, that to me became like a kind of distillation of the entire hippie movement.
Yeah, no, I see that. So, I mean, at a certain point, you move to like a more Marxist understanding of things.
Yeah, and you cut your dreads off.
Yeah, and I mean, at what point did that happen for you? I mean, because it doesn't sound like your parents were super like Marxist, lefty type people. They're more like they're coming at it from like a cultural perspective. They're coming at it from like. I mean, it sounds like the hippie thing kind of is a container for a lot of what.
Yeah, and I think like we're saying, the hippie thing is a container for the ease with which they proceed with their unexamined views. Right. And so what happened actually is I got, when you talked about, I didn't like school, but I didn't dislike school, but I did, and there's really no way to ever say these things without sounding like horrifically. Arrogant,
pretentious,
pretentious,
all that stuff.
But I did always have interest, right?
Yeah,
I did.
I mean, this show is a show about academics, so I mean, it's filled with that kind of shit.
Well, then we can just edit that out then.
Yeah.
So
we like to study. We like to read.
Yeah. So I was always right. Whether or not I gave a shit about school, which I never did. I read a lot. I had a lot of interests, and my interest, I never had a single, because I know so many people that are fellow academics always had a kind of singular column of focus, right? That even if it like branched out, I never had that. I always found, like it's kind of boring, but it was like I found so many things interesting that I didn't know what it was I wanted to focus on, but I knew that I was really tired of like sitting on a street corner stoned with idiots in Santa Cruz.
Sure.
So I decided I wanted to go to college.
Yeah.
And I found I was hitchhiking and I met these kids. I also got really tired. And you talk about East Coast, West Coast. I got so tired of California culture, and I just couldn't stand.
What do you hate about California culture?
It was just this like. First of all, it was the speed, right?
Yeah.
Like, I was raised in a fast place. I come from a fast family.
Time slows down.
Man,
in California.
I was finishing people's sentences. Like I was going nuts.
Like, yeah, go, get to the point.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
That New York thing.
Yeah, and so I saw.
Whenever I go home, my mom is like, "You talk so fast. Like, do you ever slow down?" And I'm like, "This is just how. There's only so much time in life."
Right, and like the walking in groups, and it would take like 20 minutes to go 2 blocks.
Yeah,
and so I met. It was really funny. I was looking for a ride, and I saw these 2 kids on the corner, and they both kind of looked like me. And this one dude had like dark, curly hair peeking through his dreadlocks. And I went up to them, and I was like, so what part of New York are you from? And we just started talking, and they were just a couple of Jewish kids, one from Long Island and one from North Jersey.
Sure.
Right? And after lamenting the state of bagels in Northern California, or Central California, we started traveling, and it was him and his girlfriend. It was this guy, Robbie, and his now wife, Shiri. Mm-hmm. Hello, Robbie Shiri. And we all just kind of fell in love. We just had like a great time, and then after a while, we were hitchhiking. And
you're like
around.
Mutual East Coastness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it was like being finding a slice of home.
Yeah, and we were making like kind of fun of the California approach, right?
Yeah.
And then finally they were like, "All right, well, we got to go," and I was like, "Where?" And they're like, "College," and I got really sad. I was like, "I want to go to college."
Yeah.
And so they were like, "Oh, come with us." And so they were going to this place called Prescott College, which. Still almost nobody knows unless if someone knows what this college is called. They're like, "Oh, you went to Prescott."
Yeah, where is that?
And so it's in Prescott, Arizona.
Okay.
It looks like Prescott.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
But it's Prescott.
It's Prescott?
Yeah.
Prescott.
In fact, they're wow, this is an accidental pun, but their press kit for Prescott is actually called, we call it Prescott.
Beautiful.
And so that's it. They got
it's important to them to get that right.
It's very important.
It's funny when you first started saying that in my head, I was like, you mean Prescott, right?
Yeah, no, it's Prescott.
Prescott, Arizona.
It's Prescott. Okay. And I had not spent a lot of time, with hitchhiking. We had I'd seen this, and I've always loved the Southwest landscape. It's beautiful, right? And it's so not the Northeast, right? Like at least California has
the opposite,
yeah, and California has green, has oceans, right? We have those here,
sure,
but the Southwest to me is just so alien to someone who spent his life in the Northeast.
Well, yeah, driving through the desert feels like out there feels like you're, and I think it's because it's true. It feels like you're on the bottom of the ocean after it's dried out. Yeah. And you're like, that's true though. We actually are like on a seabed right now, and there's something really fucking weird about that.
And it's also it was one of the few places that I was like, oh, I can actually imagine dinosaurs walking around. Yeah, right. Like that's
I think
this
it's
is
the most psychedelic region in the country, and why there's the whole that cliche of the Doors and everything.
Oh, I was just thinking the Jim Morrison thing. Yeah.
Taking acid.
Why don't you kill your father, Robbie? Yes, exactly.
And that's something I've never done. Is going out literally to the desert to do that because and you think about Coachella and Burning Man.
Right.
There's there's something to the desert and drug culture for sure.
Which here in those it's the top 2 places not to take psychedelics, right? It would
be
Burning Man.
Oh my God, I can't even imagine. The only trip I would have would be about American culture.
Yeah, and not a good one.
Right.
It'd be one of those fever dreams, right? Where you start shaking, then 8 hours later you're like, I'm so happy
it would be the equivalent of Hunter S. Thompson sitting in the cop convention.
Yes.
And
that's
just
exactly
oh my fucking God.
Right. That's always what I imagine when I see this is when he just keeps seeing people as lizards over and over and over, and I'm like, oh right, these are the reptiles that run things.
Solidarity with all the whole the whole of humanity. Yeah. I don't think.
Well, I always thought that was what was interesting about taking psychedelics in cities in the first place, right?
Sure.
Was that there's so many people, right, and that you're like, oh, that's a kindred spirit, and then you also and you're like, that is an evil soul, right? And God knows, right, how off you can be, right? But that's why I always liked those kinds of things around lots of people because you don't have that kind of pristine, isolated experience of the Jim Morrison desert.
Yeah, and I mean, it just amplifies being in the city like that. It just amplifies your typical feeling in the city, which is the simultaneous feeling of loving and hating everybody at the exact same time, wanting to cry with love for the torrent of humanity coming down Fifth Avenue, but then also just being completely repulsed.
Right,
by
you're
everything.
all so goddamn beautiful in the abstract.
We cannot get off on telling drug stories, but there is one I wanted to tell you that it has nothing to do with me. But it's New York. The guy that I partially wrote my book about, Fred Gardner, who started the coffee house thing. He's a big hippie dude that did a lot of acid in the 60s, and he was telling a story of how being being on acid and being on the Upper West Side, on 79th Street near the Museum of Natural History.
Yeah.
So he said he's on a high-rise apartment at some person's apartment up there. And he's looking out the window, and what he's looking at below him is the roof of the planetarium, right, at the museum.
Yeah.
So he's like, as a New Yorker, I never saw stars, right? Like the only place I ever saw stars and like the planets and everything was at the planetarium in there.
Yeah.
So now he's like, I'm 20 years old and I'm on acid and I'm looking down at the roof of it, and I had the thought that I'm looking down like from above the stars, like I'm like
at the whole celestial sphere, right? The whole thing at once.
I'm and like that was a thought that like only person that has like done that stuff would kind of recognize how profound that and how disturbing a thought that was. Because to him, he was like, I'm off the map. Like I'm above the solar system.
That's that real when you have like that Turtle Island moment where it's like turtles all the way down, man.
Yes. But he told me that story, and I like on the phone one of the first times I talked to him, and I was like, I'm gonna write a book.
I'm like, you deserve a book, sir.
So where were we? Oh, I wanted to get to like I wanted to bridge this thing from hippies to like being an academic that like studies Marxism in like the 19th century. Isn't that kind of where you ended up?
Yeah, late 19th, early 20th century. I'm like a 1880s to 1920s kind of guy.
1880s to 1920s.
Yeah.
It's fun. That is the era I'm in right now, and I'm teaching like a survey class to like 120 students at Baruch right now.
Oh, nice.
And we're doing a unit on I call it class politics in the late 19th century, but just like the growth of industrial capitalism. And God, teaching that to Baruch business students is insane. Well, and they're very antagonistic to the idea that capitalism caused any problems in the 19th century.
Right. No, and that's when you talk to students about like genuine armed insurrections, right? Like Pinkertons and National Guard, like straight up shooting into tents, to kill women and children, right? At like mining camps, like and they. I mean, the resistance is uncanny. We're like, that couldn't have happened. And you're like, it did happen, right? And then they're trying to like coalesce. And what's fascinating about teaching that kind of stuff to CUNY students is that these are by no means students who have had, lives that have been so privileged that they can imagine that capitalism wouldn't have done this.
No,
right? These are
like working class kids.
Right. These are and these are. I mean, at LaGuardia, what is it? Something like 90% of students come from families that together make less than like $30,000, right? And so these are not a privileged group of students. And so in many ways, I have found that their resistance, and understandably so, is aspirational.
Yes.
Right. Is that there is this fantasy middle class, which, right, as we know, is ever more out of reach.
Yeah.
But that there is this way of entering into capitalism that will kind of efface all of the possibility for all these problems.
And in a way, they have to believe that because of their position.
Right.
I mean, and CUNY is the class is a big factor among students at CUNY, but so is like immigration status.
Right.
So so many of my students are from first generation immigrants and their attitude towards capitalism is not like, oh, I'm critiquing capitalism, that's what I'm here for.
Right.
Their attitude towards capitalism is, that's how I'm going to make it. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing is, and I've talked to a number of people about this. It, like, for someone whose parents were immigrants, and they grew up dirt poor in the middle of Queens, and all they want to do, right, is get a good enough job so that their father doesn't have to drive a cab, for 90 hours a week. I'm not going to sit there and tell them to read the manifesto. And like, I grew up in middle class, and middle class was a pretty comfortable place, to reflect on these things. And so I at least like I'm not someone who's going to say that they're making bad. My position is not such that I would feel comfortable ever criticizing their own choices.
Yeah, no, of course not. But I mean, the 19th century thing is different. And like, I had a student that raised his hand in class the other day because he wanted to challenge the idea that the Panic of 1873. He's like, actually, that was the result of bad monetary policy, and we can't blame capitalism for those problems. And he just wanted to like have this like really like tight discussion of like economic policy in the late 19th century, which isn't what I do, first of all,
right,
and not what we were talking about, because I was talking about what the Panic of 1873. We were talking about it from the perspective of like people who lost their jobs during that,
right?
Like the social consequences of the boom and bust cycles of capitalism that were really intense during that era, and he didn't want to hear it. He's like, "This has nothing to do with capitalism.
It's just creative destruction, David.
Right?
Things got to get torn down before they can get built."
We've got the Patrick Batemans,
right?
I mean, Baruch has like people that want to be in the like work in the finance industry.
Well, and so I'm working on this chapter right now, ideally. About 1919, 1920 and the Russian Revolution, and the kind of cultural response.
Sure.
And so what's interesting is I've been reading around a little bit. I haven't done like as full of a study as I'd like to yet, but I've started reading around, the crash of 1920 to 21. And what's funny now is in the same way as that student. so many center-right commentators, right, to talk about 2008, right, and this kind of idea of secular stagnation and ways of getting us out, of the endless crisis, right? They're rereading 1920 in exactly the same way. Like, oh, it was just, they like, this is how it didn't become 29, right?
Yeah,
they didn't, loosen monetary policy. And so it's all these, but that's always the fantasy, right? The fantasy is that it's not the system itself, right? You can ameliorate the more extreme versions, right, through, some kind of centralized oversight, which is a joke, as we know. Right. And so that's always the fantasy, right? It's not the system, it's the excesses of the system, which in the pieces I'm writing about that were printed in the Saturday Evening Post is essentially exactly the same argument they were making 100 years ago, right? And it's the story that I'm writing about is really fascinating. It's called Red Friday, and it was written by this guy. Is this the kind of stuff you're talking about? Is this too in the weeds?
This is great. No, this is really great. I mean, to give, I think, people like a larger context of what you're talking about, like your stuff, you're in the you do kind of close to what Justin Rogers Cooper, who's a guest on the show a lot. He does you talk about capitalism, you talk about the 19th century, you're doing like historical work, but you're reading it like through literature. Like a lot of it is through you're in English. That's your discipline.
I definitely see it much more as cultural studies.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Which again is another placeholder, right, that allows me to do whatever the hell I want. Right?
Yeah, no, but I mean, to me, like in history, I'm always grabbing onto the cultural stuff as kind of like just, I don't know, markers. I think that stuff is really important to me to reflect that stuff. Well, so anyway, I interrupted you because you're talking about Red Friday.
Well, which
is what?
Well, just an aside, real quick though, to get what you're saying about English is by no means free of any of the disciplinary issues that history has, and so one of the reasons I got so interested in the Saturday Evening Post is that there's, especially in modernist studies and modernism just writ large, there's, obsession may be too strong, but there's a serious focus on what are known as little magazines, right? Which is where all of like the precious poetry, right, and the very modernist literature, right, gets published. What's funny to me though, as someone who's interested in culture, right, nobody read these magazines, right? They had like 1,000 people, in their subscriptions, and so that's how I got into the Saturday Evening Post. Was that's also because of Adam McKibble, my dear friend and mentor who teaches at John Jay. Okay. I took a class with him at the Graduate Center, which changed my life. And it was about periodical studies, which is what he does and what I now dabble in. And so
periodical studies. I've never really heard of that.
Yeah,
but it makes a lot of sense to me.
That's the field. Yeah. So periodical studies, right, which has traditionally been, especially because it comes out of English, has traditionally been much more interested in the quote unquote literary value of the work published there. But now this is becoming like a bigger field, right? People are actually interested in, God forbid, the things that people were actually reading. Sure. Right. And so the Saturday Evening Post, the reason why the Saturday Evening Post is such a perfect site for all this is that there has not been and probably never will be any organ, right, any publication like this. And I mean, there was a time, depending on who you read and how you and what you believe, right, where the coverage that this paper was getting in terms of subscription, right? There's never been a tastemaker of like a middle brow, how to phrase this? I'm sorry, I'm a little too caffeinated. Yeah. Like it is the middle brow mouthpiece, right? And it was the creator of in many ways, I would argue, it is the creator of what we think of, right, as middle brow, middle class American culture.
At what period of time do you think it's at its maximum in terms of being that tastemaker?
Teens, 20s, right? And so there's this guy who takes over the paper. This guy George Horace Lorimer, right, and he's this editor who becomes so synonymous with the paper himself, right? Like he makes a joke. They made a joke once, because he was such a powerful. And I think we also in 2017 can't really imagine, right, how important papers like this are, right, with this thing that everybody is reading. Totally. And because it wasn't a daily, it could reflect more on current events. Yeah. Right. And so it was essentially, and he published lots of, and one of the reasons why it's so interesting to read is because he's publishing people who are from such different ends of the spectrum, right? Yeah. And so he's publishing like these obscenely racist stories, right? Because it's 1919, 1918, 1920. So America, right, has a group of black servicemen, right, returning to the United States, seeing, right, how well they were treated in France comparatively, and, right, had been trained to use guns, right? So America is terrified. And so the Post, right, many of the stories in the Post, especially the ones that are, featuring black characters, it's very important for them to show these black characters, right, as kind of accidental heroes, right? They could have, it's unbelievable, right? Because they're actually terrified that they have a group, right, of militant, black sharpshooters, right, coming back from France and saying, wait a minute, nobody called me that in France, right? And so, but on the other hand, you have, stories by like, Sinclair Lewis and Jack London and Dreiser, right? You have these people on the left.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, it's just this kind of column where you can watch the paper kind of negotiating.
I love that.
The problem is that so much of the writing is terrible.
Yeah.
And the issues are so long that you have to get really good at skimming or you'll go nuts.
And you have, I mean, it sounds like a big project too. Because in a sense, like what you're trying to do is like, you need a wide sample to try and like, I imagine what you're trying to do is distill like the larger themes that are going on here and try to like read the history through this stuff. Right. And it would be dangerous to just use 2 issues. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like you got to read a lot of this stuff.
Well, and exactly. And also you have to kind of cut your focus down.
Yeah.
Right? You can't do a cultural history of the Post because it's everything.
You have to choose like a theme or something. Like I want to do gender in the Post or race in the Post.
Right. And so I'm particularly interested in the representation of radical politics in general.
Beautiful.
But specifically the Russian Revolution and especially how things change after the Bolshevik Revolution.
So your project is seeing how the Post is taking on the Russian Revolution?
Yeah.
Is that part of it?
This chapter that's what this chapter is.
And the larger, like what's going on with world communism?
Yeah, well, because it's really interesting. I mean,
that's awesome, dude. That's a really cool project.
Thanks. I really love it.
Yeah.
It just takes a while.
Yeah. No, I know.
But one of the things, and obviously Russia is back in the news.
Sure.
And so one of the things that becomes really interesting to me, and this was the impetus of my dissertation in the first place. I came to periodical studies accidentally because of Adam's class. But that was always what I was so interested in, was the way in which, right, what I used to think of as Cold War culture, but now I realize has a much bigger history, right, and a kind of pre-Cold War, and it's all wrapped up, right, in like the kind of, for me, it's wrapped up in the kind of Rooseveltian idea of 100% Americanism, right, and what is Americanism, and this kind of muscular capitalism that seems and muscular masculinist capitalism, right, that seems as like the natural corollary to this 100% Americanism. And so what I'm interested in, because I start in the 19th century with the Haymarket Affair, and I'm this project, and I'm really interested in the way that radical politics, especially transnational radical politics, right, are figured. And then what happens after the Russian Revolution, right? And so you've got this like hodgepodge of, German anarchists and, Union rabble rousers. And it's what is a radical is this kind of very diffuse, very, very flabby idea. And then the Bolshevik Revolution kind of provides this, world historical foil.
Yeah.
Right. And so that everything, and kind of like a reverse parallax, right? Where like every time the U.S. looks at, Bolshevik Russia, it just sees this kind of distorted funhouse mirror of itself. And and there's been people who've worked on this before.
Yeah, and we still see that with Russia.
Well, and that's what's so interesting, is that why Russia, why the Bolsheviks? And so, I've been kind of tracing this thread because it seems to be this perfect conflation of a terror of, on the one hand, anti-capitalism and anti-capitalist politics, but on the other hand, a recognition that the Bolsheviks demand a reckoning, right, with the excesses and the endless crises of capitalism. Right. And so then what the Post does is so interesting. And in this piece, Red Friday, to get all the way back to Red Friday, it's written by this guy, George Kibbe Turner, who's a name that like is completely forgotten today. Someone in media studies wrote an essay recently about this earlier piece that he wrote. He was an incredibly famous late 19th century muckraker. And he was friends with like Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell, but he's totally forgotten today because his politics are insane, right? And like Steffens, Tarbell, like, mutatis mutatis can be rehabilitated pretty easily for the left. Yeah. Right? But like, Trotsky, I was going to call him Trotsky. But Turner is... he's racist, right? He's insanely sexist. He hates Jews, right? Hates Jews. And so the way that he becomes famous is, and many of your listeners might know this, but they don't know that he was a center of it. So in the late 19th century in Chicago, there was this like insane, like this big expose about white slavery posted in Chicago. Right. That was him.
Wow.
And he's the guy that did all of like, he's the one that popularizes a man, like, you know, all these like, you know, Vice reports had to be done. And they found out that, and so his whole thing was that these beautiful, you know, Irish, you know, and German lasses were coming under the spell of these evil Jewish pimps.
Jesus.
Right? It was essentially what it was.
Yeah.
And, you know, and like, you know, just, and it was like, you know, anti-urban in general, right? The only bad things can come out of these spaces.
So is he an anti-communist too, though?
Well, so this is what's so interesting. Is he's an anti-capitalist, right? Like he's with like Steffens and Tarbell saying like this is where these things like where capitalism leads, right? Like you cannot have this level of privilege without these slums. Like he gets it, right? But then he becomes so. It makes a lot of sense to me, and anybody who knows 19th and early 20th century periodicals, he goes from McClure's to the Post, right? And so in many ways, this is just a story of like a young guy who's further on the left, probably like getting a little bit of success and starting to realizing that he wants to be conservative to save more of his cash, right?
Journalists today are doing this.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
They move between these places and you're like, oh, he's at the Atlantic now, so he's different. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And I mean, there's books about it, right? Eric Lott's book After Love and Theft is you know, about, you know, lefties that you know go astray, right? And so to me, but also, you know, for a young writer, right, you know, as we know from like, you know, Fitzgerald, like there's no better place to be published than the Post, right. So he writes this a series of stories, and they're serialized. One of them is, I mean between the years of like 1918 and 1924, he's rarely not in the Post, right? He's the guy. But he writes these two stories in particular. One is called Red Friday, and the other is called The Possibilist. And they're both imagining essentially Bolshevik revolutions in the United States and how that would work. And what's so interesting to me...
Red Friday. Now I get it.
Exactly.
This is a popular genre, the like imagining the nightmare of Bolshevism. And, Especially, I mean, I just know it from the Cold War, like from the 40s, 50s. But it sounds like you're locating it in the Red Scare of the like early 20s. Right?
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing, is that even though, right, kind of radical takeovers are pretty common from the late 19th century on,
right.
Particularly a kind of like party-driven Bolshevik-led, you know, because usually, right, when you read a lot of the other ones from the earlier in the 19th century, right, it's just chaos, right, and what's I think is so terrifying, right, about the Bolsheviks, right, you know, in that famous phrase, "I've seen the future and it works," right, is that, oh shit, like, we need to come up with a
something
more
that
coherent,
would answer that.
A more coherent response, because it seems like a lot of poor people are really thrilled in Moscow right now.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking, you Red Friday. I'm thinking Red Dawn, like the 80s movie. You know, that like there's always this like specifically Russian nightmare. I mean, whoever, liberal pundits, liberals, Democrats, they're applying this narrative to the election right now, like that.
Well, that's why I got so interested.
That is the Bolshevik, like the Russian. I mean, the Soviet Union doesn't even exist anymore,
right? And that's why
we're still like applying this model of like takeover.
Well, and we've been applying. So there's a great book called Russia Under Western Eyes, and it's by this like comparative historian of Eastern Europe. Called Martin Malia. Yeah. And he does this really great, just explaining how from essentially the 17th century, but really the 19th century and the 20th century, right, how Russia always becomes, right, if it was having a good day, right, it was, you know, it was a kind of feudal society just about to enter the age of modernity. Right. But if it was, you know, scaring the shit out of its, you know, Western neighbors, it was a quote unquote Asiatic country that just kind of ominously, you know, projected into Europe.
So it's Russia exists as a kind of like a national Rorschach test of like whatever we need it for.
Yes, exactly, right. And then obviously perfectly codified by the U.S.
Well, what do you think? I mean, we have to wrap this up because we'll have you back for an AM/FM episode. Talk about the end of the world. But like, I'm thinking about like what you had said earlier about the Cold War and kind of like widening that scope and looking for like you know the kind of wider story of America's cultural relationship to the Soviet Union and radicalism and stuff like that. Like, how much of that is like, because you said like the Cold War is this like muscular, masculine, white nationalist project. I mean, Russians are. I mean, how much do you think of like that the Soviet Union is kind of like they're also white, muscular.
Well, but not,
you know what I mean.
Not for the early 20th century, and that's actually what's so fascinating. Is they? I mean, so Russia's.
I guess I'm thinking about like that the Russian project strikes fear into the heart of Americanists because it's a
it's a masculine project of that is the opposite of what America's doing, if that makes sense. It's like a big national project that is infused with a kind of violent energy that is not capitalism.
Right. And looked like it was working.
Yeah.
Right. And especially that happens in obviously 1917. And then a few years later, you have the Panic of 1920. Right. And you're still recovering from the one in 1909.
Right.
And so capitalism looks like it's, surprise, surprise, continually beset by recurring.
It's unstable.
Right. God, who knew? Right.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Right.
And so all of a sudden, here's this good faith attempt to actually create something that gives a little bit more stability. Right. And we can talk about what happened and Stalin and all that, but I think in just
Stalin, all that,
the 30s are a complicated time. But so one of the really interesting things for me, and this was what's so perfect to answer to about the continuing fear of Russia, is that it's not just about anti-capitalist politics, right? That in many ways the Russians, at least in the late 19th and early 20th century, are not seen as white, right? When they need to not. And they're seen as Asiatic in a way that at that point means less East Asia and more Near East Asia. And so they have this almost this kind of Middle Eastern quality, to them. And so the fact that, so the way that they always disavow how socialism could ever work in the United States in the Post is by saying, Asiatics are more naturally, like slavish, and that, the individuals who populate our brave shores could never fall, prey to such a, and so it's not about whiteness. And that's one of the things that I'm realizing to look at the recent election, and that's
because Russians are white now,
especially in the mind of Putin, right, and that's the thing, is that there is.
All of this is kind of like reveals how much like that, how subjective that category is,
right,
of course. And how much that's floated, and anxiety, racial anxieties about Russia seem like they're part of this recipe too, right?
And so there's a character who's supposed to be Lenin, right? And his name is Plangenev, and every time
this is in Red Friday.
This is in Red Friday, and every time he speaks, they make a point about he has these long Asiatic sibilant syllables, right? And he's very snake-like.
Well, even in the Cold War, the propaganda looks that way.
Yeah, exactly.
The Russians are drawn as, at the very least, there's a kind of swarthy, beastly nature to them. Yeah.
Right, and so one of the things that really interests, and how I got on this, and I was always interested in Russia, and I was originally going to do a degree in kind of Slavic studies or Russian studies, but I realized that, as few jobs as there are in English, there's even less.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And I lived in Ukraine for a year, and I was what became very what I always wanted to answer, right, was when, there was a capitalist crisis. It was always a problem of the people involved in the system and not the system itself.
Right.
Right. But whenever there was, a communist crisis, it was always because the system itself was inherently unstable.
Yep.
Right. And so that was always the question at the center of all of my interests. And it took me a long time to realize, why is this one thing disavowed as problematic on its face? And this other thing is just, with a few checks and balances, right, we can ameliorate the worst excesses and move on. And so for me, so much of it, the more research I do, comes out of this kind of conflation of race and anti-capitalist politics, seen in the quote unquote immigrant hordes, right? Because God forbid there's any kind of domestic desire to no longer be exploited, right? And so it's in the way that 19th century labor rabble is dismissed, is it was always about foreign infiltration, right? That there could never be a genuine American desire to overthrow capitalism. It always had to be Germans or Italians or Russians, right? And so the more that I read, the more that I see that the kind of understanding of Russia popularly, right, is on the one hand, right, and in many ways it maps very easily onto the stereotypes of African American men, in particular in the 19th century, where on the one hand, right, they're lazy, they're slavish, they need a strong czar-like hand to oversee them. On the other hand, they're these rapacious sexual criminals that can't wait to set things on fire and steal your women.
Wow.
And I'm seeing this real connection between the way they talk about, Russian radical Bolsheviks, right, and African American men in the 19th century in particular, right?
Well, I mean, America's like weaponized capitalism is a white nationalist project.
Exactly.
And you really see that. I mean, in the way that the Cold War is going to be perpetrated on like a global scale, with the United States kind of putting out these fires all across the world.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And seeing those fires of like third world, brown people, anti-colonial movements happening, in Vietnam, in Africa, in South America, the United States is going to put all that shit down and see it, and they use their excuse is like Russia is running all this
exactly.
shit. You know
exactly.
what I mean? Russia's getting
right.
all the natives riled up, paying them, giving them guns, and then starting these revolutions.
Right. The Vietnamese could not possibly want dominion over their own lands.
In
right?
that vision, then the United States is the like representative of like white national capitalism, keeping that together for the whole world.
Well, and a particularly masculine form of it.
Right.
And
with Russia being the other pole of that. I mean, the vision of it is just so fucking insane. That's to me like why the Cold War and I mean, what you're showing us right now is like how much larger that is. Like how it's not just like something that happened after World War II.
Exactly, and that's part of what I'm writing too. Right, is this sense of the Cold War as this thing that only emerges during and after World War II, and that there is at the like. And there's these really interesting connections, right? So, in the 1830s, right, de Tocqueville has this kind of fantasy line where he talks about Russia and America, right? These two great young nations. Who knows what revolutions they'll bring forth,
Yeah.
And so there really is this weird twinning, right, for quite some time.
Yeah.
And part of it is like the vastness, right, the sea to sea, geography of both of the nations, right?
That's what I was thinking when I think about like as the Funhouse Mirror thing, right?
Right.
That we're like kind of weird twins.
Right, and you just see like on the way maps are usually structured, right? These gigantic land masses staring at each other.
Yeah.
Right, with like this terrified, Europe sandwiched between them, right? And then all the subaltern states, like comfortably nestled below.
Yeah.
Right, and that to me, that geography was always so striking. And so one of the things that I'm just trying to figure out was, in 2009, and this was like an anecdote that I opened my dissertation, and it gets back to what you were saying about how, it's been 26 years since the formal dissolution.
Yeah.
Right. And that there was this woman at a town hall in 2009 in Pennsylvania when then Senator Arlen Specter was running for re-election.
Right.
And they were talking about the idea of socialized healthcare, right, Obamacare. And this woman, right, out of nowhere, and she's an angry, right, and depending on where she lives, right, she's probably, kind of working class white woman, angry, and a group of people who would come to be right at the center of the most recent election.
Sure.
And she says to Arlen Specter, when he asks, why are you so frightened, of the idea of healthcare?
Yeah.
And she says, I don't want this country turning into a socialized country. I don't want this country turning into Russia.
Yeah.
And the idea that in 2009, right, this like rural community in Pennsylvania, that this woman, right, first of all, that socialism, right, when in this respect we're trying to like give her free healthcare, is just bad on its face, and also somehow immediately leads to something that she's calling Russia. Right?
Yeah, I know, it's so bad.
Yeah.
I mean, the stain is heavy on the American
and
psyche.
That was, but then I was like, well, what is Russia? It doesn't.
What is? I mean, we're obviously both making a lot of assumptions, but what does that woman know about Russia? Besides that kind of like marker, as that she knows that this is like the opposite of the United States,
right?
And then it would be bad.
And that's exactly right. And that's where I part of what I'm writing about is this thing I call racial socialism.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that you can't really understand the terror of communism in this country if you don't also connect it to race politics, right?
Yeah.
And that when we're always talking about anti-capitalist politics, we're also always talking about non-white people.
Yeah. No. Absolutely.
Right? And so that really is the kind of through line of the project I'm working on now.
That's great, Jesse Schwartz. Thanks for telling your story. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Alrighty, so that will do it for today. I want to thank you for listening. I want to especially thank Jesse Schwartz for coming over and chatting with me. I had a really great time, and I feel like I could talk so much more to Jesse, and I plan on having him back. So I appreciate him opening up about his childhood and his adventures in the counterculture and his adventures in academia, and I have so many more questions for him. So thanks, Jesse, and thank you. If you want more Nostalgia Trap, please throw me some bones at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And thanks so much. We'll see you next time.